All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to class on Halloween 2022. But we have a treat for you because our guest lecturer, Philippe Siraji, is back with us tonight to lead our class. And I got another treat for you. There's no quiz tonight. Oh, man. And I have a third treat for you. Philippe promised to keep the class short so that Miranda could get to her trick-or-treating. I mean her trick-or-treaters. Her trick-or-treaters, I mean. I'm teasing. We are going to try to keep it short tonight, though. There is no quiz, and we do have our special guest lecturer tonight. So how about I say a blessing for our class, and then we're going to dive in. Father, thank you so much for tonight. We just pray for all the kids outside, keep them safe. For those of us that are passing out gospel tracts with our goodies, Lord, may people be blessed by reading your truth. Lord, thank you for this apologetics class. Continue to build into us as we become better equipped to share your gospel. We commit this night to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, thank you. All right, here we are back at it. It's so much fun for me actually to be here. The class will be a little shorter than usual, as we said. Last week, Pastor Zeke, right, you did the class last week on the burden of proof. So let me make a few comments on the class overall and then on what we're going to be doing tonight, because it's, we're going someplace, right? You remember when we first started the semester, we said that we have to develop a biblical approach or biblical form of apologetics. We defined apologetics by using a few words, and one of them was challenge. And by challenging, what we mean is, because of what you heard last week about the burden of proof, for very long, unbelievers and philosophers believe that if you believe in anything, you have to be proving it yourself. Like, if I believe in God, it's on you to prove that God exists, because I don't believe in God, I don't see him, it's on you. And I think you had last week the demonstration is that though it was true in the 1920s until the 1980s, it's not really true anymore, because not believing in God raises as much, if not more, questions than if there is a God. So you have two worldviews, right? This is what we've been discussing a little bit, and now we're going to be discussing those worldviews. But before we enter into that phase of the class, I would like to show you a few things you have to understand when it comes down to be a challenger, right? To challenge other people's ideas. The reason why we have to do this, and that's what it connects this class to last week, is that we don't have to have the burden of proof just on us. Now, let me say this first. Like, we are both, I want to say, willing and capable, I think, with apologetic to engage in the defensive side of apologetics. People ask us questions. We want to be able to answer those questions, and I think this is very valuable. But like G.K. Chesterton used to say, atheism is the most daring of all dogmas because it is a universal negative, right? It's the most daring of all dogmas. Atheists will tell you they don't believe in anything, and Chesterton would contend by saying they actually believe in something bigger than God in many ways, is that they know for sure that there is absolutely no God anywhere in the universe, and that is a very daring dogma. So if it's the case, and then we'll see later on in the class, that yes, we believe in God, right? Yes, we believe yes, we're okay and willing and capable to engage with you in using arguments for the existence of God. You, as well as an atheist, must answer some of our questions, right? One of them would be, what if God does not exist? What is man? Where does man come from? Where is the meaning of life? Why do we have hope? So many things that makes us human, right? Where does our reasoning capacities come from? They cannot come from evolution because we don't need them to survive. and all these questions. So now when we have this idea, that the burden of proof, as you discussed last week with Pastor Zeke, then we need to be capable of challenging those ideas by showing how worldviews, such as atheism, for example, do not account for the reality of humankind the way Christianity would, right? So that's the point that we want to make tonight and as I said, it will be a shorter class for several reasons, but one of them is because it would be shorter. So, how do we challenge worldviews? That's the question, right? You remember we have a few out there. You have a market of ideas, right? You have all kinds of you have different religions, different views, different philosophies. You have different theism, right? People believe in God in a different way. Of course, the Muslims don't believe in God the way we do. They don't believe in Christ the way we do. They don't believe in Abraham the way we do. So there are some markets of ideas out there, and what we try to do is challenge ideas as a big part of apologetics, is finding ways to raise questions about others people's views. Okay, so what are those? Okay, so for example, you've heard me use the word empiricism several times. Empiricism is a philosophy that says basically the only way to know anything is science, right? You have the idea of empirical evidence, right? You've heard this expression before. It was really laid out by several philosophers, but one in particular, the British philosopher David Hume. I'm going to write down his name here on the board. Right, David Hume. Hume is Hume, and he really is the father of what we would call today empiricism, right? And in that worldview, or in that way of saying, people will say, well, science is the only way to know, and though we would agree with the idea that science is a great way to know, right? I don't know if you guys studied science in school or in college, but yes, when science is properly applied to its proper it's properly applied to its realm, let's put it this way, then science is a very valuable asset in knowledge, right? We experiment. We develop medical advancements. We have all kinds of things that allow us to do things today that we were not able to do before. Not that progress is always good, but that's a different story. But what we are debating is that we don't believe that science is the only way to know. And one way to challenge that is, for example, tell a scientist who tells you that science is the only way to know, that you cannot prove that statement scientifically. Empiricism in itself lays on a foundation of a presupposition that cannot be proved scientifically, right? So as finite beings, as opposite of infinite beings like God would be, then we have to start somewhere, and that's how we know things, right? Let's say that you and I have a debate on the meaning of a word. We don't agree, and I'm discussing with Miranda, and then we're discussing the word, and I'm saying this word, it means this, and Miranda says, well, I don't believe the word means that. Where will we go to settle our disagreements on the meaning of a word? A dictionary, right? Now, let's say, have you ever seen someone say, well, I don't believe in a dictionary? No, we don't have that. Right? Everybody goes to the dictionary and then it settles it. Miranda was right. I was wrong. Sorry about that. We move on. I learned something. Now, you would never find someone who says, well, let's question the motives of those who wrote the dictionary. Now, do they have an ulterior motives? We don't do that. As finite beings, we stop somewhere. To know anything, we have to start somewhere. And that's what we're saying, right? We are finite beings. We cannot know everything. So the point is the same with science. We are making assumptions when we do science that we cannot prove scientifically, right? And that is something we need to explain. And then we have someone who comes to empiricism, and you can ask them the question: well, if science is the only way to know, what scientific experiment could we set up to prove that statement? And obviously, there is no way to prove that statement, therefore we assume it's true, but we cannot prove that. And that it would be one way to challenge the idea of empiricism, right? And the other way would say, well, there is other things that matter in energy, and how do we know those things? How can we think about those things? And we would be in a position to actually discuss the fact that empiricism is really limited into the material world. It's not because, and you see, it's one of those catch-22 / circular reasoning type of argument, because they will tell you, I don't believe in anything, I believe in science, and I believe science is the only way to know, therefore there is nothing beyond matter and energy, because I don't believe science can test any of those things. And that's one of the way to have a circular reasoning, right? So it become here empiricism as one thing that most people will actually believe, The other thing we can discuss, I'm just giving you a few ideas so you know what we mean by challenging, someone. Then you have the idea of agnosticism. I don't know if you heard that term before. An agnostic is someone that really doesn't think he can know. Or someone who doesn't know, right? You have the word gnostic in here in Greek, gnosis. I'm sure you've heard this before, gnosis, epignosis. It's a Greek word for knowing, right? An agnostic, or anytime you have an A before the Greek word, it's always a negative, right? You have atheist, atheists, agnostic, and agnostic. Every time you have an A before a Greek word or a word that comes from the Greek, then you have the opposite of the word, okay? So an agnostic is someone that believes that you cannot know. And there's two kinds of agnostics, right? One that we can really have a conversation with, and the other one would be difficult to have a conversation with. So the first one is the guy who tells you, I don't know, okay? I'm not telling you there is no God. I'm not telling you there is a God. I just don't know. This is a very good way, a very good person to have a conversation with, right? Because they don't know, and maybe they're willing to hear what you have to say, but this is not the type of agnostics we're talking about. The agnostics, or the skeptic would be another one, will tell you that we cannot know. That's what they will tell you. Yeah, I've met a few of those guys, and particularly in France or in Europe, you have a lot of those guys. If they're not atheists, they will bluntly be agnostics. And they will tell you, well, there's no way to know. Right? So basically, they are making a statement about knowledge in itself. And if you notice, if I tell you, for example, I'm going to do a little exercise. And if you have an answer to my question, then you give it to me. If I tell you, as an agnostic would say, you cannot know the truth, how would you challenge my sentence? You cannot know the truth. What would be one way to challenge what I'm saying? Because if you haven't heard this sentence, you will. Who wants to try it? If I'm telling you you cannot know the truth, what would be your answer?
Well, if you say you cannot know the truth, the suggestion is there is a standard called truth. And how can you not know something and say that when in fact you'd have to believe there is truth that you cannot know, and therefore the implication is there is truth.
Very simply, right? It's what we call a self-defeating statement or a self-defeating argument, right? If I'm telling you you cannot know truth, or some people will go even further than that they will tell you there is no truth. And you could question that class. Let's think about this, okay? If I put this over here on the board, there is no truth. Right? I'm making that blunt statement. Guys, I'm sorry to tell you, but there is no truth. Then what kind of fun question could we ask for the sake of the argument? What would be a funny way to raise the question? What is truth will be one way, okay? But if I say there is no truth, what could you say, what question could you ask about that statement that would be fun to ask?
Well, you could say prove it.
We could say prove it, yes, but I'm asking for a question. Like what question, if I'm coming to you, I'm telling you, oh, well, sir, there is no truth. What would be a thing, Michel?
You could ask, how do you know?
Yeah. We could ask, how do you know? Yes. And think about another question we could ask. Miranda, what would I say or what would you say? Okay, we could ask just why would you say? That would be another way of saying what Michel said. You could also ask the very simple question, almost sarcastically. Is that true? Right? Oh, there is no truth. Is that right? Is that true? Well, if they tell you yes, so you're saying, you see my problem here. Because if this sentence is true, then there is truth in your sentence. But if your sentence is true, then your sentence is not true at the same time. You see? Well, yeah, but people will tell you that, right? That, well, there is no truth. Well, yes. That will be, well, it depends. It might be, it changes. But it's true. At some point, gas has a specific price, or the color of the walls are white. There is a ceiling on top of the thing. We are on this particular city. We are so many miles away from Baltimore. You could also say, well, when you fly, where there is both gravity and higher dynamics that play, we say a lot of things. Your car, a diesel car will use diesel fuel. There's many things we say all the time. So there's one way which would be listing the truth that we know for a fact as to show there is no truth. But even, I think it's funnier for me, it's even more interesting for me to say, well, your very sentence has no meaning in itself, because if your sentence is true, then truth does exist, and therefore your sentence is both true and untrue at the same time. So it's funny, I think one way to help people understand where you're going is to show the problem that you have with their statement. That is a very, very good, not to mock someone and say, well, you should know better, or, as I said earlier, I think it's a bit of sarcasm for me to say, is that true? But in the same time, I like to do this as fun, or you cannot know truth. What would be, if I would say, in the same line of argument, if I would tell you, you cannot know truth, what would be your question to me? Like, as I said, there is no truth. I'm asking you, is that true? If I'm telling you you cannot know truth, how would you ask the question to me? You want to try it? Yeah, okay. The microphone's right there for you.
Earlier you were talking about definition. Don't you ask or probe what is the definition, your definition of truth? Because does it include sensory? Does it include this or that, or is it just ideational?
Yeah.
In other words, I could see you might be able to argue truth or no truth on the basis of the theory of relativism. Truth is relative, and so therefore there's no specific truth, because in every situation that truth varies.
Yes. So, well, when someone would argue that truth is relative, that's also something we can argue against, because if truth is always relative, then the sentence truth is relative is also relative, which means the sentence in itself is meaningless, right? But then you could ask the question, when people say there is no truth, is that true? And then we say, when you cannot know the truth, one way to ask the question would be, how do you know that? Because I'm saying you cannot know truth, and you're asking me, but apparently you know that you cannot know truth. So how come you can know that you cannot know anything about truth and actually believe that at the same time? Because if I'm telling you you cannot know truth, I do know something about it, which is you can't know it. So why do I stop there? If I believe that I cannot know truth, then I'm actually making a statement that it is possible to know that you cannot know truth. So what would allow me to stop there? Well, if it's possible for you to know anything about truth, what makes you think you cannot know anything else about it? You see? So one way to have a conversation with someone is always to help them understand the implications of their statement, right? This is very important when somebody says something, that you have that in our mind, So we're going to look at two biblical texts. I think it's great for us to turn there, because I think you will see that both in the book of Job and in Matthew 22, Jesus has one way of investigating people's mind in a conversation, and one way is asking the right questions, right? I think as in apologetics, what we want to do is asking the right questions, and I think this is something we need to understand, right? So if you want to turn in your Bibles in Job 13, verse 3, and then we will look at other verses as well. But let's turn first in Job 13, verse 3. Because Job is asking for an interview with God, right? And from his viewpoint, just like all of us, like from our viewpoint, we feel vindicated, in our viewpoint. Like if I'm saying something, I believe it. If you meet someone who believes that there is no God, he really says he believes there is no God because he believes he's vindicated in belief that there is no God. It's rare to find someone who's going to say something just to say something, right? So someone comes to you and make a statement, they usually think they thought it through, they have a proper arguments, they have a strong foundation to think in such a way. And this is where we are actually, as in apologetics, this is why we are here. We need to help them see that actually you don't have a strong foundation on your thinking. When we said earlier, if I'm telling you there is no truth, and I'm actually saying a self-defeating statement. You see, if you've never heard anyone say what I say tonight, this is why you don't see, now you know, if you see a statement like this, you will know it's a self-defeating statement. But you've never seen this before the way we're talking about tonight. So imagine someone who really, really believes this. There is no way they can see the self-defeating aspects of their affirmation. This is why we need to make that statement. Now, in apologetic, remember at the beginning of the semester we said it has both meaning, defense and of offense, right? In the defense, as we said early in the class, we are capable and willing to answer questions, and we want to make a point. But because of last week's class with Pastor Zeke, we also know that the burden of proof does not only rely on the Christian, right? If you are making a statement that there is no God, it's so universally negative that you have to explain to us where we come from. If there is no God, you have a big question in front of you, is where does the universe come from? And number two, even harder, which is what we call biogenesis, where does life come from? So you have those two big questions that people will actually, you can raise in the conversation. If you don't believe in God, then you have a lot of proving to do, right? Because those questions need, of course, people will say, well, the universe has always been there. No, it hasn't. It is impossible for both scientific and philosophical reasons. So we can go on and on. But the point here is that we have to understand the mindset of people when you talk with them or when you speak with them, that someone will make a statement because they believe they can. And it's okay. I think everybody is free to express their own opinions, and I think we should be able to do that. But our goal when we do evangelism, as we are discussing the gospel, as we said several times, somebody raises a question, and we want to be able to answer the question, but also want to help them see that their alternative worldview does not answer their own question. That is a very, very successful line of argument in a conversation. I think I told you once the conversation I had with my dad in the car, right? I was going to a city someplace, it was close enough, I took the train. I was living in Paris at the time. My dad lived in the south, so I went to a conference in the university that was invited to go. I go there, do what I had to do. On my way back, I'm just 30 minutes away from my dad. I take the train, I go to his home. I spend there a couple days to hang out with him. And then on the way back, he takes me to the train station and go back to Paris, and he asked me the question. I see, because he's troubled, he has issues in the health, and he's interested in God, but he's also wondering how is it possible for me to believe in God? So he asked many questions, and one of them was, well, how do you, and it's a question I'm sure you've heard many times before, how can you believe that there is a God because there is so much evil in the world? Right, so is that a legitimate question for someone to ask? Yes, it is, and particularly for him at the time. I think this particular year, he went to the hospital 10 times to get surgery 10 times in a row. So it's like he went through a lot that year. So it's asking, and if he feels at this time, he felt like he's a good person. And he actually, on the human standard, is a very good person, or was a very good person because he passed. But so, and here we have this conversation, and I'm thinking, he's wondering, you know, how come? You know, how come? When we ask the question, is why do bad things happen to good people? That would be one way. So there's two ways to answer the question. Well, oh my God, how can I explain to him my God is really, really good, but there's free will, and there's so many components. It sounds like a recipe. You know, you have to develop a super complex argument. You have 50 grams of free will, and then 200 milliliters of God's goodness, but you have 50 milliliters of God's justice. Therefore, there has to be, you know. And then, of course, we can. And I'm actually, I could spend sometimes with him explaining, and I did for a few minutes. I tell him I have an answer for you, and the answer is based on the fact that for us to be free agents, we have to be capable of seeing the consequences of our decisions. So he understood that. But then the question I asked him is, okay, but as an atheist, how do you account for evil in the world? And that just brought a completely dead silence for a few minutes. First, he's never been asked the question before, and then he realized for the first time, he doesn't even know why it bothers him. Because I told him, think for a minute, you're making a lot of assumptions. Number one assumption is that there are such things as good people. Well, if there is no God, how do you measure goodness in people? According to their own standard, education standard, society standard, transcending existing standard, how do you measure that? Assumption number two you're making is that you can actually look at deeds and things in the world and blame and post them and actually label them as evil. On what standard do you do that? Again, there is no objective truth. There is no objective standards for morality since there is no God. So why does that bother you? And then I went on, assumption number three is that you should be making, but you're not making at this point, is that, and I quoted him a text from Richard Dawkins, who is the famous atheist biologist, and he said, basically, evil in the world or pain in the world is something that must exist for evolution to be possible, right? You've heard the sentence, the survival of the fittest. What does it mean? Like, it sounds good. Like, survival, yeah, I'm on top. But it means that everybody who's not on top is at the bottom. And this should be the way we live our lives. Now, are we bothered by the top guys, these top tech guys, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, they decide for us? Yeah, I mean, that's the way evolution works. They're the top guys, and you are at the bottom. You're a bottom feeder, you're at the bottom of the food chain, and that's the way it is. And as Richard Dawkins said, it must be so. So then I explained to him in this conversation, he said, but don't you see? But he said, well, I understand what you're saying, but then in the meantime, he's saying, but it does not resonate well with who we are. I said, there you go. That's what I'm talking about. For you to be able to make sense of this world, you have to borrow from Christian principles. One of them is that your life is meaningful, that you should have hope, you're looking for a better life. All these things that actually mean that you as an individual is looking for meaning in his life. And you're looking for an explanation. You're trying to make sense of the world. Now, tell me why and how can you explain that in an evolutionary model? If evolution is true, why are you craving for meaning? So we had this conversation back and forth, and you see what I was doing in the conversation is, yes, I do have an answer for you, and we went on and have this conversation based on free will, and it's something maybe we'll have time to discuss another time, but for the first time he realized that by challenging his ideas, he actually realized the very reason why he was bothered by evil in the world, because his own theory did not fit his own life. He does not agree with the consequences of what he believes to be true, which is evolution, right? So you see, in those conversations, when somebody comes to you, they feel like they're vindicated in telling you something, but they've never been challenged. Hence the importance of doing that in a conversation, for them to realize for the first time, yeah, I do have questions for you, but actually, at the end of the conversation, I have questions for myself. My worldview does not make any sense. And we see that with God. That's the way God does it also. So let's go back to Job here, 13:3. Job he wished for an interview with God, right? So he said, but I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. And he did get the interview. Actually, he did. You've read the book of Job. He did get the interview, and actually it was not an interview. It was the other way around. God asked him some 200 questions, and in a way put him back in his place. It's not that God wanted to humiliate Job, because Job was already humiliated by his situations. But God wanted to remind him that his ground for questioning God did not make any sense. So what are the questions that God asked Job? Who are you? Where were you when I created the foundation of the world? I mean, in a way, it would be one way to say, who do you think you are? Like, you think you got it together. You think you know everything, right? You think that what you're going through is unfair. You don't see the big picture. So he goes on and on and on. In verse 42, verse 1 through 6, we can read that paragraph here, that Job 42, 1 through 6. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. You see, in a way, what we're saying by challenging, it's nothing really original. It's just like God's way of doing things, because, I mean, even though God welcomes our input, God, like we see that, remember when God said, should I? He wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember what he said? He said, well, should I do anything without consulting my friend, Abraham? So Abraham is negotiating with God. Well, how about if there is 50 righteous? And it goes down to, and then God says, no, I will spare the city. So it goes on and on in the conversation. But you see, God is interested in the conversation, right? He wants to have that. He says in the book of Isaiah, let's come and let's reason together. So Job's questions or willingness to be with God and say, I want to reason with him, is not unreasonable. It's not something that God finds offensive at all, right? So in our lives, like, I don't know if, and this is a parenthesis maybe for a practical aspects in our life as well, but if you find something in your life that you don't feel is right, or you don't think, and you want an answer, well, yeah, we can ask the question to God. Like, I can pray about it. I can ask God the question. But the thing is, the way God answers might be very well the way we're trying to say. It's like, okay, I can ask, but before I answer the question, let me ask you a few of my own, right? And this is exactly what God did for 3 long chapters. He's asking the questions and questions and questions. And here we are at the end. Job is saying, well, John replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You say, listen, and I will speak. I will question, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So the response from Job is actually shows the effectiveness of God's questioning method to Job, right? So I'm not saying it worked because God did it to Job, it's going to work every time. But you see the effect that actually Job realized, well, yes, in my previous point of view, my questions made sense. But now that everything is put back into perspective, my questions don't make any sense anymore. I forgot that, just like someone like Bertrand Russell, I've quoted him a few times, the atheist philosopher British, from the 20th century. I think he died in the 1970s. And he said, when he was asked one day by a journalist, like, okay, let's say you die and then God does exist and you find yourself in his presence. What would you tell him? And he said, well, you didn't give me enough proof. That's what he said. He said to the journalist, I will tell God I didn't believe in him because he did not give me enough proof. And he said that at that moment in his life. I don't know what he said later on. I don't think he ever became a Christian. No indication of that. And I don't know if he actually, I doubt that he came before God and actually had the audacity to say what he wanted to say. Because now he knows. And the point here is that we want that realization in people's life before it's too late. So challenging ideas, as we're discussing tonight, is this one opportunity to actually assess our own philosophies as atheists, or their own philosophies as atheists, by looking at things and wonder, am I making any sense here? If I'm saying this over here, that there is no truth, and you tell me is that true, and all of a sudden I realize for the first time, well, my whole life is based on this, therefore I was able to reject Christianity because nothing is true, and you telling me that this sentence is self-defeating. It's the first time in my life I have to reconsider that sentence, but I also have to reconsider that since truth is somewhere, could it be Christianity? You see, it's a very simple conversation that we're having with someone, but by challenging the ideas that they have, then we're showing them for the first time they are not so strongly founded in their philosophies. They have to question their own ways, and that is a very good place to be. This is exactly what happened to all of us as Christians, and that's exactly what happened to Job over here. Let's see what Jesus did in Matthew 22. Matthew 22. We're going to read from verse 41 to verse 46. You got it? Matthew 22, 41 to 46. And just saying here, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. So it's interesting because you always have this crowd of people that know better than the crowd of people before. So the Sadducees come to Jesus, he silenced them by saying, okay, like only Jesus would, they think they have some. Remember when they come to him with the coin, with the deeper question, because they wanted to trap him. So should we pay the taxes? The idea, if he says yes, then the Jews will be against him. If he says no, the Romans will be against him. There we go. So very easy. And Jesus comes with a very, very interesting approach. He asks for the coins. Say, whose face on it? Well, it's Caesar. Well, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what's God. Any other questions? And they were silenced as well, right? So it's interesting here. So they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him the question, testing it, and say, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandments. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments, hang all the law and the prophets." And then he spoke there. And then while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they said to him, "The son of David." They said to them, "Then how then does David in the spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word. Not from that day or on did anyone dare question him anymore. So the result here is like, of course, he's dealing with enemies. He's dealing with people who's trying to. But then you see what Jesus does. He's asking questions about their own assumptions, right? Asking questions about people's presuppositions and assumptions is something we have to do. Well, they're trying to, they will use a verse, if it's the Pharisees or the Sadducees. People will use a quote. They'll use something they heard in class or they learned in college. And then you have to be able to answer to address that by asking a question that challenges their own presuppositions. That's what we call in philosophy underlying assumptions, right? People will make statements based on presuppositions they don't know how to formulate. And these are the ones you need to identify in the conversation. Okay? What are the underlying assumptions that someone makes without actually being capable of identifying those ones? And as I said with my dad, for example, he was assuming many of the things that make his question possible for him. But many of the assumptions they made were actually Christian assumptions. That there is such a thing as right and wrong. There is such a thing as good and evil. There is such a thing as meaning in life. There is such a thing as value for the human life. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, none of those things would exist if there were no God. Right? So if there is no God, then all these questions become completely unanswerable, but the very question itself shouldn't be raised. Right? C.S. Lewis asked the question a little bit this way, and he says in his mind, like, he assumed a few things. Number one is that his reasoning capacities were reliable, and then he realized, wait a minute, like, if my brain hasn't been designed to think, how do I know it's reliable? Because it's not designed to think if there is no God. So how do we know it's reliable? The other thing he says, he's actually looking at the universe, and he says, the universe does not make any sense. And he said, wait a minute, if the universe did not make any sense, I would never have discovered that it did not make any sense. He's like having these thoughts for himself. For me to assume that the universe is purposeless, I wouldn't even have the concept of purpose in my own mind. And then for him was the one way he actually was brought to Christ, by realizing that all his arguments against God were based on assumptions that made God impossible not to exist. For me to be able to powerfully argue against God, I have to believe that my brain is capable of thinking, therefore it had to be designed. One apologist, his name is Cornelius Van Til, he used to say, when men argue against God, it's like a kid sitting on his father's lap to slap him in the face. This is the same idea. The only way a kid can actually reach the dad's face if the kid is carried by the dad. Imagine, I don't know, I mean, Shay, you're quite tall, you're 6'3", I don't know how you, it's, after 6 we don't count, it's useless because it's up there in the mountains. But then, how tall is your daughter? Half your size? Yeah, exactly half your size. Look at that. So she's exactly so she's about, compared to him, she's about this high, right? Do you think she's capable of slapping her daddy in the head if he doesn't bow down again? He can't. She can't. It's the same idea that the only way for us to argue against God is to use the brain He gave us. And if we didn't have the brain He gave us, then our brain wouldn't be reliable to make any sorts of arguments. And that's the beauty of what we're saying here. Is you see, challenging other people's minds and ideas and identifying their underlying assumptions is something we have to do. So this is what Jesus did over here. And that's very, very interesting. Now, yes, of course.
There's this, maybe it's a definition problem, but Jesus said at one time, ye are gods. But in both the devil's and Adam's case, they would or wanted to be and thought they could be like God. And so is there a definition problem here? God has two different meanings, that humans can be called gods, but that has a different sense from God Almighty.
Yes.
I say the basis was, some people call it rebellion. Other people say just believing deception, that they could be like God when actually they were not created like that.
Yes. I mean, I've read I've never studied the words that Jesus used for God when He says that in the Bible, and I think I should do that before I give you an answer. But it's true that, anyway, if you look at this like from an apologetic standpoint, what you realize is, I don't know if you've heard of the philosophy called anthropotheism, which actually states that man will evolve into turning into smaller gods, right? The answer, it's a current philosophy, right? They are developing. You have it comes out of what they call transhumanism, right? Mankind will transcend itself to become its own deistic entity, right? Humanity is what is all over all of us. So the idea of man using the term God for themselves is something very current. So that would be very interesting to investigate, but I don't think I would have a good answer for you today. Okay, so now, um, so you see what we've been doing tonight. What are we trying to do? We're trying to show you how, before we actually do, maybe later on, some actual challenging with arguments themselves, I'm trying to show you the importance of having that as a mindset, right? Because in Deuteronomy 21, our rocks is not like their rocks, right? This is the idea. Our rock is not like their rock. And the point we're making here is not only we can live our faith, we can reason about it, but we can live our faith intelligently, right? I can have answers for your questions. I can show you how solid my foundation is, but I need also to show you how weak your foundation is, and because you've never seen that before. You know, most people who believe that there is no God believe that they're completely vindicated. How many times I've seen people ask me the question, okay, this is the 21st century. How can you believe in God when science explains everything? Whoa, there's 25 assumptions in your sentences that you can prove right there. One of them is, how is it possible that science can explain everything because science cannot explain your very sentence? You know, so and you think you proudly come and thinking that reason is on my side and faith, which is the opposite of reason, is on your side. Therefore, I can be vindicating in telling you what I think. How many times I have seen that in friends, family, people in the street? They look at you like saying, "Well, you should know better." Like I'm too I've heard this once. When I'm way too smart to believe in God. Oh, you're my favorite candidate right there. I want to have a conversation with you because you are making such an interesting statement. And I ask him the questions, how do you know what intelligence is? And then, well, what do you mean? But, well, I don't know. You're telling me that you're too smart. Apparently you are. I'm not saying you're not, but I actually believe you are. But then we want to, in conversation, explain that how can you be sure of what you're saying? Like, I asked him a question. The philosopher, I've been working on this question for a long time. Apparently, you resolved it. Is how do you know for sure that there are other minds that yours around you? How do you know that I'm speaking to you not out of your own imagination? How do you know that? You're making so many assumptions. So we went on the conversation, and he went from high horse over here to sitting down for a long time and having a conversation man to man. And at the end, he realizes, well, you're making some good points and you need to think about it. And everything, we went from a high horse to actually a genuine conversation by just asking a few questions and showing him that I don't want to burst your bubble here, but actually there is no foundation in what you're saying. And the funniest thing is, if there were any foundations to your statements, they would have to be borrowed from my Christian perspective. And he says, for the first time we realize the very reason why, and we'll go back to the idea of the kid being capable of slapping their dad's or mother's face, is because they are either carried or the parents are sitting down and they're on their laps. So so the point was, this is always very efficient because we have to let people know. It's the same thing with us as Christians. When we go to church on Sunday morning or whenever we go to church, midweek service, whatever we do, have you ever been challenged by the message? You almost like you get a slap on the face. How many times I have been challenged? Many, many times. I think I know. I've been a Christian for, 36 years. I've been a Christian for a long time, right? I've been to Bible college. I went to Christian university, and I studied for a while. I know my Bible pretty well, I think, at least. And here I am on Sunday morning and getting slapped in the face because I don't understand who God is really and being challenged. And I thought over here, you hear the passage, well, yeah, I studied it last week, and you think it's a good passage. And then you're completely surprised by the Holy Spirit in the message because you didn't know God how you ought to know. We don't know God how we ought to know. So that shock that we get as Christians is exactly the shock that we need to give people when they come with assurance by asking them, hold on for a second, can I ask you a few questions and then we can talk about this. This is very, very crucial. And the last thing I would like to make part of that conversation is we need to be able to identify what we call false dilemmas, right? Hold on for a second. This down over here. false dilemma. You know what a dilemma is, right? Is when you have, like, or you could say dichotomy, whatever you want. You have two things that they're apparently paradoxical. They cannot be reconciled. And people will use those sometimes, and they will make assumptions. And these are very, very common. And I think if you are capable of understanding what they are, and you will be able to understand. Okay, so the first one is faith versus reason. That's the first thing people will assume that are not compatible. Faith versus reason. It's a dilemma, right? I don't know if anybody studied logic in university, but a false dilemma is one way of arguing wrongly, right? You have the straw man argument, you have the ad hominem argument, and you have the false dilemmas. And the false dilemma is opposing two things as an assumption. Like faith and reason don't work together. Therefore, one of us must have reason, and whoever doesn't have reason has faith, and faith is the opposite of reason, therefore it's ridiculous. That would be one dilemma. And many people will tell you, like I said earlier about the guy who says, this is the 21st century, science explains everything, science are the good guys because they're the smart people, therefore the only thing you have left is being an idiot because you believe in God. That is in itself a false dilemma, right? And you could ask the question, you have to be able to identify those because they will help you understand people's mindset. And when you are capable of doing this, looking at those and identify what they are, then you can start talking with the person and say, okay, hold on for a second, let me ask you a few questions. How do we know that science is, how do you know, you could say the question, that's because that's what you're saying, that science is the only way to know. Explain that to me, right? So, yeah, so I'm going to give you two others, then we go back to it. The other one is faith versus science. We have faith versus reason, and the other one is faith versus science. These are very common dilemmas. People oppose reason, faith, and they certainly oppose faith and science. And the third one, which actually would be very easier to identify, it's the one we had that we have that nowadays in our society. Now it's and by a false dilemma, they give you two choices. It's endorse or hate. I'm going to explain that in a moment. Endorse or hate. And we see that today because they tell you, like for example, as Christians, we have certain convictions about facts of society or ethical issues. About, for example, abortion or maybe gay marriage, all these things. Or we have convictions based on what we believe the Bible is saying. And the world will put us into a choice that would be what we call a false dilemma. There is no third option. Either you agree and endorse, like for example, the gay marriage agenda, and if you don't, you hate them. It's either or. That is a false dilemma. There is a third way that we want to argue for, but for you and I to be able to see those, because many people actually, the reason why usually Christians will fall into either or, I rarely find Christians that are balanced on the issue because they actually fall for either one, because they think they don't see the third option, and they don't see a third option because they don't know how to question false dilemmas. And my family is the same thing. I have very little number of Christians in my family. Most people in my family are not Christians, and of course, I'm the Christian in the area. So of course, when they ask questions, of course they're going to ask me because, what do you think about this? And so they always think think something just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees would go to Jesus, except I'm not as capable as Jesus, of course, to answer. But so I have to explain myself, and the thing is, well, like your church or the church in general, you hate gay people. Oh, okay. So what do you mean by it? Well, because you don't support the gay marriage. And they don't even know that they're actually endorsing a false dilemma. You see, so and then one way of asking the question would be, are you telling me that there's no third option? Can I suggest a third option? One way would be, is it possible? That's what I told my cousin. Is it possible for me to disagree with someone and still love them? Is it possible for me to do that? And I asked him the question, do you always hate the people you don't agree with? Of course not. So we agree. There is a third option. And then I went on explaining, I said, what do you know about the word tolerance? And he explained to me, well, tolerance is because you let people be. So live and let live, that would be tolerance. Okay, well, yeah, actually, yes, it is. But then asking the question, like, tolerating for you means that everybody who believes anything should be accepted as true. That's the new meaning of tolerance. But I said, don't you think that the word tolerance in itself means that there has to be a disagreement for to be any tolerance? If there is no disagreement, there is no need for tolerance, right? He never thought of that before either, because the new definition for tolerance is everybody's right. You believe this, you believe this, you believe the opposite, everybody's right. If you don't agree with this, then you're not tolerant. But the very meaning of tolerance is agreeing that to disagree. That's the very meaning of tolerance. So, anyway, about the false dilemma, we had this conversation, and I was actually discussing with him and saying that you're trying to put on me a choice that you limited for no reason. And I'm actually suggesting the third way of, and the same thing with faith and reason, is same thing with faith and science, right? There is a third way. Faith and reason, they are not opposite, because reason is one way to reason, and faith is a different kind of reasoning that includes God into the equation. Faith and science, they are not opposite, they just don't investigate the same realm. See, so when people put us in front of a false dilemma, and the third one is also the same, endorse or hate. If you don't march with us on the gay pride, then you're homophobic. It's either or. And we're saying no. I think if you ask me the question, are people, if there is gay marriage, should people, in this country, for example, I don't know if you have gay marriage, I think you do in some states, right? As a Christian, those two guys over there, they're married. They answer to God, they don't answer to me. It's not my problem. But you don't love them. Yes, I do. I love them like I would love anybody else. If they, like the previous house we were living in, our two neighbors, two ladies, they were in their late 60s. They've been together since the 70s. So they were gay before it was a thing, if you want them one way, right? So they were, before it was popular, they were gay. And they've been together their whole life. I think they've never married because they couldn't marry at the time, but I think they lived together for 35 or 40 years. And one of them gets healed. They are next door neighbors, so like one house over, like I want to say 20 feet over. And one of them, and on the other side we have this old couple. His wife passed away. So my neighbor on the left, his wife passed away, and my neighbor on the right, her wife, let's put it this way, has cancer, terminal cancer. So if the world was right, that we were endorsing or hating, either or, then I would have treated my neighbor over here one way and my neighbors over there a different way. They are going through difficult times, but these neighbors lost his wife, and this neighbor is about to lose her wife, right? Are they both, even in a way, none of them are Christians. He's not a Christian, so where does he go if he dies? Hell. And where do they go if they die? So this guy is a nice neighbor, he's going to hell. These one are bad neighbors, but they're going to hell as well. So, and you start thinking this way, and I realize with my way we're saying, well, it doesn't make a difference, because even though I don't agree with their lifestyle is between them and God at this time. And my only thing as a neighbor is realize, okay, maybe if they die, if she dies, and doesn't hear the gospel, she will go to hell. So we prepare food for this guy, and we prepare food for those guys. We go in there and visit them and ask them how they're doing, he's doing, and we go over there and ask him how they're doing. There's no difference. And that's what we're saying as Christians. Do I endure their lifestyle? But no, I don't. Do I endure his lifestyle? I don't either. The guy was an addict gambler, and he wasted all of his money, and then, so which one is the worst sinner? But this is not our game as Christians, right? So the point being here is that the world wants to put us under a false dilemma, and we put ourselves under a false dilemma. So I'm going over there, and we minister to them as much as we would for anybody else. Her name was Kathy. She passed a few months later, and we cared for the other lady as much as we could. Then we moved out, and then we to another house. But then the people who came after lived there, and they were from Algiers as well, and they did the same. They loved those people because the point is the one common denominator between an atheist, a perfect man that served his country for 25 years and had the Purple Heart and is a standing citizen, he loves, he gives to charities, and the guy over there who is gay, the common denominator is they both, all of them need Christ. And that's what we care about as Christians. So I'm not interested in that false dilemma. And I don't want anybody to put me in that false dilemma. I want to be able to think for myself. I want to be able to challenge them. And I need to be able to identify those so I can actually go in the conversation and have a genuine, loving conversation with the people I'm talking to. And this is what apologetics should be doing and enabling in our hearts. Okay? So, as I said, we are going to finish earlier today. Do we have any questions or comments before we finish? Yes.
What do you do when you have, let's say, the government or even individuals taking not a passive role but an active role, saying, we are gay, we are superior to you. If you criticize us or we think you're criticizing us, we will persecute you.
Yes.
I mean, the case in point is China trying to get into every church and make the government doctrine the church's doctrine, yes, or at least a mix, yes, of the two. And the pastor may say, but your assumption is that the government is God. And have you ever looked at the frailty of government, mm-hmm, all the problems that the government has right now, even in China, you know, great debt, the need to feed population, mm-hmm, just problems perhaps greater than we have, mm-hmm, you know, and that's what leads to war and other things like that. But the government thinks it's right, yes, and we think we're right, and the government doesn't want to tolerate the Apostle Paul or the Christian, yes, and so throws them in prison and other things like that. Paul sometimes, you know, was able, maybe in one case, to get through to the leadership and they repented. But in many other cases, they weren't listening. And yet they weren't persecuting him in every case, like Felix and others. Yeah. They said, well, if he had said, you know, if he hadn't said he was a Roman citizen, he'd be scot-free, yes, or other things like that. So they were sort of passive toward that. They weren't pushing back on Paul. We want to get him. So that seems to be the main problem of, or one of the main problems of Christians, is that, yes, persecuting when they try to proselytize. Yes. And the main one is interfaithism, which says everybody's religion is okay. Yes. And there's no one way, and if there is a one way, we will persecute you, yeah, because you believe in an error and you don't want to change to our way of thinking. Yes. You know, so.
So I think it's a complex question in one way. So I think in one way, so we live. I come from a democracy. Here, you guys live in democracy. It's one way of government. It's not the biblical way of government. The Bible doesn't say anything about our freedom to choose our governments, right? There's nothing about that. So whatever culture we have in which we're growing is that we have a freedom that we enjoy, and we can use it as Christians. We are citizens of the country that we're in. We're also citizens of heaven. That's what Martin Luther called the two kingdoms, right? So, and one thing we need to know is the reason why. Okay, so I'm teaching a class of ethics next semester in Baltimore, and the main point we're making is that we have to know. So I'm trying to say it without being too long, but okay, the point is we have to understand there are two kingdoms: kingdom of heaven, of which I'm a citizen, and kingdom of the earth, of which I'm a citizen of France, and you guys are citizens of America. So what we need to be careful as Christians is that our culture, as American, as French, or whoever we are, does not dictate our behavior as Christians. We are Christians first, and we are citizens of our countries second. Okay, that's very important. Now, I know in the American culture is different than the Western culture of Europe. Very different. We see governments a different way. We understand their role differently. But these are cultural differences. They are not biblical differences. Now, in the Bible, there is nothing to be said. There's nothing that is said about persecution except the fact that we have to accept it for what it is. There is no vindication for any Christian to take arms and go against the government. There is no revolution indication in the Bible. There is none of that. So as Christians, if we were to be at some point saying, you guys need to shut up in your church because you're against the government agenda, we have a very simple thing to do. We preach Christ no matter what, and we suffer the consequences. That's the only thing we can do. Now, to prevent that, we can make smart choices by choosing the right people in our elections. I know you have an election coming up with November 8th or something here. Yeah, so you can make right choices by actually going out there and putting your vote in. But if your candidate doesn't win, Christ is still on the throne. And if my candidate wins, Christ is still on the throne as well. So this is the mindset I need to have. Is whatever comes my way, there's two things that are constant in scriptures. Romans 13, we obey the government. And Paul says in Acts 7 that when we have a choice between the government and God, we obey God. Two simple guidelines that are very simple to understand, right? So I don't think, I don't really give a lot of thought as a Christian beyond that. I don't hope, and one thing that I see among Christians that I find very dangerous is when people have so much hope in the candidate that they have, that he will turn things around. And I think this is a very wrong way of seeing the role of government on this world, because there is no way that we can accept someone who's going to be my candidate as the Messiah. This is not going to happen. They are not God, and they shouldn't be. So I understand I can go this way, and I can see a government and say, well, I can preach against what I see. I can say things against what I see. But on the other hand, when my candidate wins, I have to look at him and say, well, this is not godly either. So I could spend my whole life actually looking at the world and telling them how they're wrong, and that's where I wanted to go back about Christian ethics. The main contention that I actually using as a guideline for my class in Christian ethics is that if I'm trying to change society without letting people being changed in their hearts, I'm actually doing legalism with unsaved people. Let's say we have a church over here, and the people over there are all sinners in the parking lot, and they want to come in, and we say, guys, okay, what's your problem? Oh, you're drug addict? Change that, and you'll be able to come. Or you're gay? Change your ways, and you'll be able to come. Do you think you guys will want me as your pastor? I don't think so. You kick me out of it. Are you kidding me? They need to be inside. Nevertheless, this is what we do with the society. They should be better. Like we're thinking, oh, abortion is wrong, and abortion is wrong. But what do we expect? People are wrong. Abortion is not a problem of abortion. Abortion is a problem of people who want to be promiscuous in sexuality. So they want to live left and right whatever they want. Therefore, we have a problem with abortion. So if people would get saved, right? If let's say 90% of Americans get saved tomorrow in the youth revival, do you think all the problems we're discussing would be taken care of? They will. So the problem is Christ and salvation. The problem is not ethics. The problem is not the problems, right? So I think it's a very good question. I think so. What's the takeaway from that? Number one is God puts us in the place so He wants us to be active in our communities. So we do vote. We do voice our concerns. I have neighbors that don't agree with me. If they want to have a conversation about political things, I'm interested because it might be a way in to have a conversation that is bigger about Christ. But if I have a choice between having a political conversation or having a preaching or a Word of God conversation, it'll always be a Word of God conversation over a political conversation for me. That's all. All right? Does that answer your question? Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a good night. And voila.